Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. I am here in beautiful United Kingdom, and I am therefore looking around at various different property markets, etc. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Knightsbridge property market has been ridiculous. I mean, London has been famously high over the last while, but in particular, some very narrow areas where prices just went nuts over the last decade or so. And so it makes it for an interesting conversation about what is going on, because actually a bunch of those properties are sitting empty. Now we can draw some parallels to some things that happen with, for example, Vancouver in Canada, where you've seen housing prices rise a lot, in particular in kind of the downtown and maybe West Van areas. A few others as well, but those two would kind of stand out. And it is a situation where a lot of properties are vacant. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about taxes related to vacancy, use of property, effects on kind of general population, rising costs of property, what that looks like, why properties are sitting empty, etc. Because it's something that maybe people don't have really a lot of perspective on, kind of the dynamics behind it. So let's dive in. Before we do, if you already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. If you'd like help with relocating abroad, figuring out the best second residency, citizenship, Plan B, etc. to get, optimizing your global tax, etc., please reach out to us. We can help you with both figuring out the best solution for you as well as implementing it. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or you can send a message through offshorecitizen.net. Okay, so as I was saying, there's a lot of vacant property, and you can ask this question of, okay, why would I buy $1 million or $5 million or $10 million property and leave it vacant? Wouldn't I want to earn rental yield? And it's worth understanding that typically people who are in this situation fall into one of two categories. One is they simply have a lot of money and they just don't want to disturb their situation. I was talking to someone earlier today who is doing some estate planning, used to work for me, and they're talking to me about dealing with a $25 billion net worth client. Well, when you have $25 billion, are you going to be concerned about the rent you're going to get off your $5 or $10 million place? Probably not, right? So that's one factor. The other factor comes in, which is that the people who are buying are typically not doing so as an investment so much as for capital preservation. And this is a really key distinction. It also factors into why would you buy in these really central high value areas as opposed to buying in a further out area where the yield might be better. And the answer is you want something which is going to have longevity in terms of the demand and liquidity associated with that. So this is pretty interesting, and explains also what the situation has been in Dubai. So Dubai is sort of like second fiddle to some place like London. Okay, so if you just imagine you're from India, you're from China, you're from somewhere else in Asia, you're somewhere else in Africa, where you have a lack of geopolitical stability, maybe a lack of currency stability, maybe corruption in the government, maybe these are people who got money from corruption, right? But in some form, money is not safe in those countries. I've mentioned this in some previous videos, that on a risk-weighted basis, typically the safety of the money is just not that great in a bunch of these countries, which is why people don't leave their money there. They move it to places like London. Likewise with Vancouver, likewise parts of Australia, where they have a strong legal framework that is hopefully going to protect it. Now, obviously, kind of following war in Ukraine, Russian oligarchs, etc., there's some uncertainty for at least a certain subset of the population about how that plays out. But you are in a situation where you're afraid of your money in your home country. And when you cannot trust the banks in your home country, the question becomes, what do you do with that money? Now, one logical thing to do is to move it to another country, but it's being eroded by inflation and things like this. So what's the alternative? What do you typically know coming from that environment? Well, you typically know real estate. There's also other advantages in terms of ability to kind of hide the source of funds, or kind of essentially bring it into the system in this way. So there's been a lot of money that's flowed into these environments, buying properties quite expensive, not particularly concerned about the value, focusing more on, hey, they tend to go up because this is this high demand area. And that has some pretty serious consequences for the locals, because these properties end up sitting empty. property's empty, of course, means there's less places for locals to rent. Because there's less places for locals to rent, that drives up the prices of the other areas, and this comes to the second part of this discussion, which is bad housing policies in general. So the reason, if you look at housing prices have risen, is a supply-demand imbalance. Now, there's two sides to that supply-demand imbalance. One is, you would think if the prices were high enough, builders would be coming in and building more. But what do you have? You have a combination of factors. One is you've got a situation where the laws, particularly related to zoning, safety, and environment, tend to be quite terrible. I'll give you a story that's kind of funny. I have a good friend in the real estate game who was talking to me a little bit about how difficult it is to get the permitting to be able to build in California. So if you want to build in some good location in California, this is a multi-year process to be able to just do the permitting to build. Not building, not selling, not whatever, just being able to get there is a pain. And you have to do successive environmental reports, and each one you can basically add a zero to the cost of it. And it's so ridiculous that in the one case he said a friend of his brought him into his office and said, hey, come here, let me show you this. And they flipped about it was about a 1,000-page environmental report they just finished. And they flipped through about 60% and came to this place where they had inserted 6 pages verbatim of a porno script. And it's like, this is ridiculous, but the whole point is you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to generate some studies, some report, etc., that nobody's going to read. It's completely asinine. It's the dysfunction of our system. We have this terrible derangement that is going on in these areas. And so because it's really difficult to build, because it's really slow, because it's really hard, because it's really expensive, this drives up costs. So I'll hear stories like, oh, we're working on affordable housing. Well, if you want affordable housing, all you have to do is open up sufficient supply that you're in this, and make it easy enough and cheap enough to build that builders come in, meet the demand, close that gap, because basically if I can build for dramatically more than I can sell it for, I'm going to build lots, right? I'll just keep doing that. Obviously you have financing considerations in there. But the more I can do that, the faster I can turn over the money, the more you can reduce the risk, the more I'm going to tighten this up, and that's not going to be an issue. So you have that problem. The second problem is you have really terrible landlord-tenant acts. So you're in a situation where the laws mean, for example, in some places that you cannot kick somebody out of a property if they don't have somewhere else to go. This is a common thing in various parts of Europe. Like I have good friends who have property in Amsterdam who will not rent long-term. They would rather leave the place empty and rent on Airbnb short-term rentals because they aren't constrained. They'll actually be able to get rid of the person if it's an issue. This is a problem, right? What does this do? This screws up your entire market. You get something similar in Germany. You get something similar in a bunch of these places. Then you've got rent controls, right? There was a story in New York of somebody who was paid, I believe it was $17 million to leave a place because of the fact that he had rent controls. They wanted to renovate the building and he just refused to leave. And ultimately that was what they had to pay. They had to do that, plus they had to buy him another apartment, but not give it to him because they didn't want to pay the taxes on it. So they rented it back to him for $1 a month. It's a famous, just ridiculous story, right? Like the fact that the law would allow that it's ridiculous. The place was probably worth $1 million or something. The person was paying a few $100s a month. He turned down first an offer for $500,000, then an offer for $1 million. And ultimately this was what ended up happening. Like the fact that the laws do this, what does it do? Does it create an incentive for builders to come in there and increase capacity and things like that? No, it does not. So you've got this really messed up set of laws. So what have we got on the flip side? Now we have on the flip side, because people want to leave places empty, something like in Vancouver, they've implemented vacant property taxes. And vacant property taxes, they started at, I think it was 1%, then 1.25%, then 3%, I believe they did starting in 2022, and now going to, I believe it is 5% in 2023 of the property value. So $1 million property will have it's 3 to 5%, depending on the time, per year tax if the property is left empty, essentially trying to force them to rent it, because otherwise, you're going to lose that money. So it's going to cost you double instead of just what you're losing in lost rent. Obviously, then they have to police this. They have, I think, scheduled something like 20,000 audits in the next period. And so there's this kind of like whole series of government systems have created a bunch of problems. okay, combined with some issues around people bringing money in, but let's think about the money coming in thing. If what they want to do is store the money, then just give them a way to store the money. Don't require them to put it into property. In fact, you could simply do what's happened in China, obviously, and just build places that are going to be left empty because you're going to leave it empty anyway. And that becomes like essentially a savings account for them, because that's what effectively is going on there. And you don't have to deal with this. So you create a bunch of problems where you don't deal with it through proper legislation, and then you layer another set on in order to try and correct your first problem instead of solving the root problem. So anyway, I would expect to see in a bunch of cases these types of things happening more. I think it will continue that people will want to have places. Now, over time, if we get into a situation in certain markets where we see declining population, that could change the dynamics, but I wouldn't expect to see that in areas where there's high immigration, such as Canada, for the next while. And so in the meantime, this is the environment. So anyway, would love to hear what you guys think. Put it in the comments below, and I will look forward to seeing you on the next video.